global economy is in the sweet spot. Now we can see from this map depicting the green countries that are growing that 90% of the world is showing growth. This global expansion is a tailwind for US GDP. So you may know the US recovery is tied to be the second longest in history. It's been going for 35 quarters. And with this global growth to support it, it's even possible we could match the longest recovery in history, which lasted 40 quarters. Now, we don't want to just look at the length of the recovery. We also want to look at the quality of that recovery and several components of GDP growth. So on this graph, we have a lot of variables to unpack. We have a stacked bar graph where the bottom bar depicts inflation and the top bar depicts real GDP. If we add these two things together, inflation plus real GDP, we get what's called nominal GDP. And nominal GDP is a really important indicator to look at in relation to interest rates. So we also have on this graph the 10-year yield, which is the green line, and we have the Fed funds rate, which is the red line. Now, if you look back to 2006, you can see that the Fed funds went above the 10-year yield, and this is called an inversion of the yield curve. And an inversion of the yield curve is an important thing to watch for because it indicates that a recession is coming. Now you'll notice our current forecast has the 10-year yield and the Fed funds getting pretty close to each other, but we don't yet have an inverted yield curve. And when we think about what would change this forecast, the key variable here is that inflation rate. An increase in the pace of inflation would cause the Fed to raise that Fed funds rate at a slightly faster pace, and if the 10-year yield stayed on our forecast trajectory, we would end up with an inverted yield curve. Now, there are many good arguments as to why inflation is likely to remain moderate. The primary reason is that wage inflation is still low. It has been between about 2.5% and 3% for the past year, and the 40-year average for wage inflation is 3.4%. So we're certainly not at the overheating point just yet. But needless to say, we are watching inflation and its causes quite closely, and we'll be updating you if we believe it's going to pick up anytime soon. Furthermore, we're watching the yield curve, and if it starts to invert, we will increase the probability of a recession over the coming quarters.